Welcome to the Sponsored Rider Club podcast, your guide to motorsports sponsorship. Here's your host, Josh Weesey.
Hello, and welcome to episode 58 of the Sponsored Rider Club podcast, which is powered by impactfuel.org. My name is Josh Weesey, and I'm your host. I'm here to guide you through this crazy, complex world of motorsports sponsorship. To help me with that today, I have our featured guest on. His name is Jim Riley. He is of Baja United and also AZUÑIA Tequila. He's basically a marketing wizard, so make sure that you are taking notes for this one. Now, before we get into the structure of the podcast and also the interview with Jim, I have a few things to discuss with you. First, I'd love to get your feedback. So if you'd be so kind as to head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review, that would be phenomenal. And I've been reading the reviews on this show, and the next one is coming from Dirty Rice Off-Road. So this rating says, every episode is loaded with such great stories and info from all over the motorsports industry. Enthusiasts, racers, content creators, even sponsors all get something to take away to help improve upon what we do. So I really appreciate them for taking the time to leave that review. If you do the same, I will be reading it on this show in the future. And whatever podcast player you prefer, go ahead and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our upcoming guests. Now, specifically, our next one is part of what I'm calling a youth racing series special. I have a few youth racers that are going to be coming on over the next several weeks. And up first is going to be Caden and Sarah Danbury. Caden is a 9-year-old UTV racer who is just on fire right now. And we're going to talk about all of the challenges that come along with that from the parent standpoint and also from Caden's standpoint, plus the really good things that come along with setting up a new youth sponsorship program. So stay tuned for that next week. Now, if you ever want to get insider access or get insights on our upcoming guests, check out the Sponsored Rider Club on Facebook and request to join. And if you ever want to shoot me an email directly for a guest recommendation or just to, chat, go ahead and send me an email at podcast@impactfuel.org. Now, this episode is brought to you by 4 awesome companies. We have SolderWeld. They produce game-changing metal bonding technology products. We have TopThePodium.com, who are experts in motorsport sponsorship. Bold Racing and Suspension, they're a family race team and custom suspension experts. And then we have Neverlift Racing Company, who produces the Armor Coat product. And you're going to hear more about them later on. But if you already know about Armor Coat and you just want to get 10% off your next order, go ahead and use ARMOR10 promo code at ArmorCoatProducts.com. And there's a couple of other partners that we work with on special builds and projects, and I just want to give them a quick shout out, and that is MBRP, HMK, and Studboy Traction. Now, the structure of this podcast is set up like a race. We'll begin with the qualifier, which is basic introduction, and then in Heat 1, we'll dive into Jim's background, and then we'll dive into Heat 2, which in this case is pretty long and in-depth, but that's what you are really here for, is for the sponsorship tactics and strategies. In the main event, though, we have a really condensed main event, where we typically discuss mindset, but honestly we discuss it a little bit throughout the show. And then we'll end at the finish line where we'll get closing comments and contact information for Jim. Without further ado, let's hop in. All right, well, welcome everybody to this episode of the Sponsored Rider Club podcast. Today I'm joined by our featured guest, which is Jim Riley. Now, before I ask Jim to introduce himself, I just want to tell you Jim Riley comes heavily recommended by Jim Beaver, who has been on episode 4 and also on episode 50. So I'm excited to have this Jim Riley on the show. So Jim, why don't you go ahead and give us a quick intro about you?
Well, that was a heck of a referral from Jim Beaver, and thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to getting on this podcast, man. I got to tell you that I love what you're doing and where you're heading with it. And I've certainly been in and out of the sponsored world the last, 7 to 8 years. So thrilled to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm pumped too, and I just realized how many times I said the word Jim in that intro. I mean, that's a lot. There's got to be like a limit for how many times you can say Jim on the air. I'll have to check those regulations and see if we're still meeting that.
Well, it's better than saying Beaver a whole bunch, okay?
Right. Yes. There are some better ways, some better words to say multiple times. Well, what I want to do in Heat 1 is dive deeper in your background, because there's a lot of stuff that you've done in your past, building brands and also sponsorship world. We're going to get into all that stuff. So I want to definitely dive deep. But to start us off, I mean, how did you get into motorsports? How did you really get into that world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get asked it often because I didn't grow up in motorsports. I was a surfer in the early '80s and surfed most of my life, and motorsports just wasn't part of what I did. But one thing that I did have every year was what I would call a lofty goal of something that I wanted to accomplish each year. And when the movie Dust to Glory came out, it's got to be 10 years ago or so. It was a feature on the Baja 1000 and all these big teams running the race and trying to overcome the Baja 1000. I made that my lofty goal to go out and try to experience what the Baja 1000 was like. And fortunately for me, I was through business colleagues. I was the vice president of marketing for Kettle One Vodka at the time, and through some close connections, I wound up meeting a person by the name of Cameron Steele. And I'm not sure if he's been on your show before, but he'd be a great person to have on. And Cameron is basically an icon in off-road racing and everything Baja. And basically Cameron invited me to come out and be a part of the team at any level, whatever I felt like doing. And that was my first exposure to motorsports. But more importantly, what got me in the car, actually, and that was a call that I received from Cameron telling me that if I was able to come up with $2,500, I could go race the San Felipe 250 in the passenger seat of a trophy truck. And I don't know who would pass that up if he had some money sitting around, right?
Right.
So I called him back. I said, hey, look, I got the money. Count me in. I want to go race the race. And he had a second team, basically a second trophy truck with a different driver. And he said, pay him the money. You can go ride. And, I wanted to do a good job. I just thought, hey, I'm going to come out and I want to do a good job for these guys. And by the way, if I could bring a sponsor to the table, can I put a sticker on the car? And literally, that was my pitch to them back. And they said, yeah, you put whatever you want on that car. It's our second truck. We don't care. So in off-road racing or the motorsports industry, my first sponsor was Smart Water. I was working with them at Kettle One on some other projects. I said, hey, look, I'm going to go race this race. What do you guys think? And they're like, yeah, we'll pitch in. We'll support you. So my first check was for $2,500 to go race the San Felipe 250 in a trophy truck with Cameron Steele and his team.
That's perfect. And to answer one of your earlier questions, Cameron Steele has not been on this show. However, it is one of my missions to get him on the show. So he's on my list of people to get on.
Well, when I get off the air with you, man, I'm going to send him an email and introduce you guys. So maybe we can get him on the show.
That's what I'm talking about there. I love that story. I know you had told that story on Jim Beaver's show, and it's just fascinating to me that you turned it from a request to probably just have fun, right? It was a request for fun. You're like, well, maybe I can spice things up just a little bit here with a little bit of sponsorship piece and, pulling Smart Water. So that's pretty cool. How did you even think to do that? Like, I mean, I know that you've got a marketing background and whatnot, but like, how did you know to do that?
Well, let's be clear, man. And I'm sure this resonates with a lot of your listeners. Nobody just has $2,500 laying around, right? But
Yeah.
but you have a huge desire to go racing or go do something that's really fun and exhilarating, So you find the money, right? And I happen to be doing a lot of events where you got these big sponsors like Vitamin Water and Monster and Red Bull and playing in that world. And I thought maybe I could pitch one of these guys on a sponsorship. We'll put their sticker on the car. So I mean, look, at the end of the day, it just comes down to dollars and cents, and how do you get somebody to help pay for your passion of, at this time for me was to go racing in Mexico.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know what the actual terminology is for this, but necessity drives innovation. Like, I need $2,500, therefore I'm going to innovate here and create something that's going to make it work. So, good.
Well, if you think back on all those motivational books that you may have read or listened to their podcasts, it's like they talk about writing down your goals. You can't achieve them unless you write them down, and once you write them down, they start to resonate in your mind. And I've always had this philosophy: what you believe is what you will achieve. And I approach tough subjects that way. And in this case, like, okay, I got to get $2,500 so I can go race in Mexico.
There is another phrase which I'll probably butcher, but it's along those same lines. What you believe is what you achieve, and it's It's oh gosh, I can't remember it. It's so good. I might have to come back to it. What when you started saying it, what you believe is what you achieve. I thought of it, and it's
Well, that one's been around since the 70s. Mark Victor Hansen coined that. Most people don't know who he is, but he was the co-author in the Chicken Soup for the Soul series.
Oh.
And believe it or not, sorry, listeners, I got that in the 70s when I was just, at a young age, and it was on cassette tape, if anybody knows what a cassette tape is.
I've heard of these. I've heard of these devices. Well, that's good, man. It's good advice, and we've talked about goal setting on the show a little bit before, and it's pretty critical. I kind of started doing it maybe 2 years ago, and I would say it's game changing. It really is.
Yeah, you've got to do it, and if you think about that small start that I had, with Smart Water and the $2,500, it's like, okay, well, how does this set me up for the future? Like, what path am I going to be on, from this start in off-road racing? I got to tell you, man, once you get out there and you race at that level in a 900 horsepower monster, you walk away going, how do I keep doing this? And what was interesting, kind of what led me on to the next 9 years of racing is Cameron called me after the race, and he goes, hey, man, I thought we were partners. I said, we are. Why? And he goes, well, you made my other truck look so good, and that other driver, you made hero cards, and you got the sponsor, and you were doing a little bit of marketing for him, handing out flyers and this and that. You created this email blast and newsletter. I said, well, I wanted to do a good job for my sponsor. And basically what Cameron approached me with is he said, look, if you can help us with our marketing and our sponsorships, you can ride in my navigator seat in the trophy truck and run our program with us. And Cameron, of course, already had some great sponsors from his history in off-road racing. But that's really what set me off on a career in off-road racing all the way up until today and the level that I'm at. So it was really taking something small and building off of it and putting the right pieces in place.
No, that's perfect. I remembered the quote.
Okay, shoot it.
I remembered it. So you don't ask yourself, or you don't tell yourself that I can't afford something. You say, how can I afford something? So it's along those lines of like how you approach or how you present problems or opportunities to yourself, then that's how you determine your solution. So if you look at an issue and you say, I can't afford that, or I can't make it there, I don't have the $2,500, then you will not have the $2,500 and you will not be able to do that task. But if you look at it and say, how can I do that? You're asking yourself that question. Your mind wants to answer it, and you come up with a solution. So,
well, I'll tell you too, and if you operate that way, you'll take that $2,500 as the foundation that I started with, and fast forward the 9 years that I've been racing, right? And I look at my equipment. I've got a shop that's 1,800 square feet. I have 2 race cars, worth over $300,000 between the two of them. I've got enough equipment to rebuild both of them on any given day. And I've had a team off and on of 15 guys, trailers, support vehicles, T-shirts, hats, stickers, hero cards, etc. And I look back and go, wow, how did I get here? And a whole bunch of bills, right? But the reality is that you build upon that foundation, and you don't tell yourself you can't do it, and eventually you look back and go, wow, I really kind of built like this little empire of fun activities and in my world, a great race program.
Yeah, definitely. Well, a lot happened in between there. What are some other things that kind of occurred along that path?
Well, I ran with Cameron for a couple of years in the trophy truck and had a great experience with him. And one thing I got to talk about that I think is important to being a professional athlete, and I consider you a professional athlete when people start paying you to go do what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. Big companies. And one thing that I learned is that you have to start small. You have to be a student first. And racing with Cameron in the navigator seat, I never touched the steering wheel in a race. And for a lot of guys that's tough. For some people that might have the money and resources to go out and race, they immediately want to be in the driver's seat of these high-powered vehicles, and it's not the best place to start. So one thing I always teach is be a student first, do your time, learn all the aspects of the sport and the dynamics of the vehicle or what you're going to go race, and be prepared for the day that you are behind the wheel. And so that was a huge learning experience for me, is just to sit back and be a passenger and be good at it and learn the aspects of a race team. But from there, what my next step was, after racing for Cameron for 2 years, or with Cameron for 2 years, I built relationships with sponsors. I got to know the other racers. I got to know the race series, because there's 3 or 4 off-road series. And I got to learn how to present myself as a racer to these sponsors. And I wound up building a real small race program in a vehicle called a Trophy Light, which is a 4-cylinder trophy truck. Basically, it's got the fancy suspension, but it's a 4-cylinder. And I started to run that vehicle in the Best in Desert series, which was Nevada and Arizona. So it was a great entry into racing for me.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Did you run all the races there? Like, did you do the Vegas to Reno and things like that?
Yeah, so I was able to pull enough dollars together through some sponsors to buy a vehicle, and at the time, a new Trophy Light was $50,000. I bought a used one for $30,000, and I started slapping stickers on there, potential sponsors, and kind of building a little bit of what my program was going to look like. I raced 2 races. My first year, it was the tail end of the year, got my feet wet, and for all those beginners out there, yes, I rolled my car in the first race on the first lap. It happens. I'll admit it right here on the show.
Yeah.
Take my wounds and lick my wounds, as they say. But what I did from there is I committed to running the Trophy Light series the following year in Best in Desert, 6-race series, and I partnered with somebody by the name of Rick Johnson. He had just won the championship, and his vehicle was going up for sale for personal reasons. And I thought, God, here's a chance to partner with a guy that's a champion. And what wound up happening is we raced the series, and we won the championships the following 2 years together. And we set all kinds of records for Trophy Lights. As an example, you brought up Vegas to Reno. We were the first Trophy Light team to finish Vegas to Reno in a Trophy Light. Took us 29 hours. We wound up, of course, winning because we were the first ones to cross the finish line in a Trophy Light. And then we were also the first Trophy Light to finish the Baja 1000. And it happened to be the year that it was from point to point, which is Ensenada to Cabo. And that took us 21 hours. And we won our class in that race as well. So 2 huge accomplishments during my tenure with Trophy Light, beyond just winning 2 championships.
One thing that I learned in my small run at Vegas to Reno, I got to pit for Bold Racing this year. It was 2017, but I got to talk to some of the trophy truck drivers and Trophy Lights and things like that, and I had no comprehension about how much prep work went into these vehicles. Like, you run a race and you got to go back through the entire vehicle. Like,
yeah.
I understood that. I understood that you probably have to, maybe rebuild the motor or, get some new tires or replace the shocks. I didn't think you had to go and check every single weld and, like, completely strip the frame and verify every single weld is still strong. I'm like, holy cow.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing that most people don't understand about off-road racing. I mean, you got to realize how violent that car is in the terrain, hitting rocks and bumps and cracks and crevices at speed, and in a Trophy Light, those things will do 80 miles an hour, and in my current vehicle, it'll do 120 miles an hour plus. When you hit a rock, 100 miles an hour, something's going to crack, bend, or break. Hopefully not if you're lucky, right? It has always been my rule of thumb to tear that vehicle down after every race. And like I said, I've been at this almost 8 years now. It's the smart way to race, and it's the way to run a solid program. And I guess that could be a nice point to make note of for anybody looking to build a program. and be sponsored is you need to run a solid program professionally, and in off-road, probably in your dirt bike categories or any of your extreme categories, ATVs or snowmobiles, rebuild those things after each race, because there's cracks and wear and tear that could take you out of the next race, or at least take you off the podium for the next race. Mm-hmm. So, to your point, we tear that thing down to the frame. Every race, we check for cracks, and then we put it all back together.
Yeah, it's incredible. And that's not cheap, right? And that's why the sponsorship packages are very, very critical and very important. Especially when you get to that scale, trophy truck scale is huge. And, a rebuild, the rebuild is probably 40, 50K sometimes, right? So
it can be. And you have to build it into your program, whether you're a sponsored rider or you're running it on your own dime, build the rebuilds back into your program, because that's what's going to keep you on the podium, putting out a top-notch vehicle for every race. And if you're on the podium, that's going to help the sponsorships, or it's going to bring the sponsorships, Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't realize that.
No, definitely. Well, that was some pretty good insights into, your background in racing and motorsports. One thing, though, that we didn't touch on yet was some of your marketing background. So you alluded to your Kettle One experience, but what other things came from that?
Yeah, well, and I'll tell you what got me the Kettle One gig, because that was a pretty big move for me. I had spent 4 years up in Lake Tahoe as a food and beverage director for Sierra Tahoe Ski Resort. For a lot of people that aren't aware, that was one of the first ski resorts to champion snowboarding and allow snowboarding at the resort. The GM there, John Rice, actually traveled the world promoting snowboarding. So it was awesome for me to be at a place where it was on the forefront of snowboarding, which I was an avid snowboarder. But what was cool for me from a marketing perspective is that we worked with like Vans on the Warped Tour. We did a Boarding for Breast Cancer event every year where we raised money for breast cancer, but we worked with a lot of bands. And that's where I started getting a taste of marketing and insight to sponsorships and working events and working with partners and kind of showing what that value was. Because at a ski resort, we wanted to make sure that our sponsors and our events came back. So we always rolled out the red carpet, and I learned what it was like to ask these companies, hey, what are your goals for this event? What do you expect from us as a ski resort? Especially dealing with companies like Vans, and making sure that they were happy. I also was able to, through the resort, they'd bought a bunch of airtime through a local TV channel, PAX Television, and that ran, basically it aired from Reno over Tahoe and into Sacramento, and I was able to do a Saturday morning TV show for 2 years, basically representing the ski resort. So it gave me a huge amount of marketing experience in terms of going on air, talking about different things, whether that was what we were doing in food and beverage and or events coming up and, what was the snow like and all these things. So I really started learning how to talk about, the intricacies of what and who we were and seeing the value through TV. And that, by the way, that's what landed me the job at Kettle One. I was their marketing manager, and then I grew into the vice president of marketing there. So that was a little bit of my background that gave me kind of the strength to be a marketeer and learn how to promote brands, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a cool story too, and I like how honestly you were involved in something that kind of changed the whole game of skiing, right? I mean,
yeah.
Honestly, that kind of blew my mind away. What you just told me is that snowboarding wasn't accepted early on, or it wasn't promoted properly, or that it just wasn't a thing. I'm like, wow, it blows my mind that actually at some point wasn't a natural thing for ski resorts to accept snowboard. So that's pretty amazing that you were involved in that transformation. Yeah,
well, and to your point, man, when I was there, I showed up and it was already a snowboard resort, snowboard friendly, and maybe that's why I gravitated towards it. But, when you start talking about when you're in that industry, like, hey, what other resort do we want to visit? And literally we had to say to ourselves, me and my friends, like, oh, well, we can't go there because they don't allow snowboarding. It's like to think about that today, it's like, wow, they don't allow snowboarding. And I remember several years later, I was heading out to Utah, and I was like researching, like, who allows snowboarding? And at the time, everybody did except for one resort. Of course, we didn't go there, but yeah, there was a time where there wasn't snowboarding everywhere, and it wasn't the sport that it is today. You know, and if you think about Lake Tahoe, it's got 15 ski resorts there. It's the largest conglomerate of ski resorts in one small area. So those were fun times.
That's wild. So yeah, post Kettle One, you know, you had a new opportunity. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, you know, my mindset has always been, and I'm working on a book that hopefully will be out in the next couple of years, but my philosophy has always been the answer is yes. Okay, the answer is yes. So when I was at Kettle One, I knew that the company was going to sell. As a vice president, we had a little bit of preview to some insights over there. And I happened to be in a sponsorship meeting, and after the meeting, somebody approached me because he saw my Kettle One card, and he goes, hey, my family has a distillery down in Mexico. They've been making tequila for Sammy Hagar over at Cabo Wabo. He sold the company, and the distillery is sitting here dormant. You know, are you interested in coming down and looking at our property and maybe bringing tequila to the United States? You know, you have this background at Kettle One. And very quickly I said, yes, I am. So I went down and did some exploration down there, and just fell in love with mainland Mexico. As I mentioned earlier, I've been surfing since the 80s, spent a lot of time down in Baja surfing. And, you know, to go down to Mexico really was, you know, part of who I was. But to go to mainland and experience that was exciting for me. And what I wound up doing is building a partnership with this distillery and creating a brand called AZUñia Tequila back in 2007. And really kind of, you know, exciting times for me. Kettle One sold. It was a big deal, over $1 billion. And I took some of the money that I was able to get from that and run and start AZUñia Tequila up here in the U.S.
That's a good story. And part of the reason why I want people to hear that is because we talk about a race program as being a business a lot in this podcast. Whether you're the only person on the team, potentially, it's still a business. And, you know, maybe some people have 15, 20 people on their team, and that's a little bit more obvious of business. But ultimately, the reason why I wanted you to share some of those experiences is that type of knowledge and background is what, you know, helps build a sponsorship program too. So I think I want people to understand that you can pull in some of that information into your sponsorship program and make really good decisions about building a brand. So it's another reason why people should listen to the rest of this podcast, because we're going to be diving deeper into that in Heat 2. And I just want people to know where this information is coming from. It's coming from experience in building brands and also sponsorship. Yeah.
Well, that's a great point. So, yeah, when we get around to Heat 2 and we can flesh that a little bit more, because we got a lot of important things to talk about as it relates to having your own company as well as having some sponsorships and leveraging the two together so that you can maximize not only your own goals within your own company, but also maximize what you're doing for your sponsors.
Definitely. Well, I think it's a good point then. Right before we hop into Heat 2, I just want to take a minute to thank the sponsors for this podcast. I think you will all agree with me on this one. One of the most critical elements to a successful racing setup is your suspension. And that's why we're going to talk next about Bold Racing. So Bold Racing is a family-owned business that grew up in the racing world, and they specialize in providing cutting-edge custom suspensions with exceptional service at a great price. So if you're in the United States and you're looking for a custom setup for your race machine, whether it be a dirt bike, a UTV, or an ATV, get a hold of Bold Racing. All right, so I'm going to start off by giving you a phone number. The phone number is 702-506-5354. You can also email them bold.racing@yahoo.com. And yes, they are available on social media. Check them out on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Or if you just have any questions, feel free to email me, podcast@impactfuel.com. All right, well, since you're listening to this podcast, I know that you want to learn better ways to market yourself in the motorsports industry, and that's why I'm going to talk next about topthepodium.com. So topthepodium.com, they are experts in social media, web design, sponsorship, and consulting in this motorsports industry. And they know what they're doing. They've been around. They got experience. They're racers themselves. They're good with graphics and web design, so they can help you out with those things. They can help generate autograph posters and make them look professional. They can help you out putting together a sponsorship proposal. Maybe it's a press release or race reports. You can get assistance there. Email marketing, website design. I mean, all sorts of different stuff. What I need you to do, though, is check them out. So you can go over to topthepodium.com. You can email them, info@topthepodium.com. Check them out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and definitely utilize this resource so you can learn how to attract and retain sponsors and look great in the process. Have you ever been out on the trail or at the track or in the middle of the desert and something breaks? Well, of course you have. We've all been there. But a lot of people at that point, they reach into their trusty toolbox for the duct tape or the zip ties or wrenches to fix their machine. However, there's a feeling that you get when you realize you need more than just duct tape to fix that rock chip in your radiator. That's a horrible, horrible feeling to have. And that's why I'm going to tell you next about SolderWeld's metal bonding products, specifically alloy sol. So this product gives you a longer term fix than JB Weld, which is just going to get you back to the trailer or back to the pits. With basically the assistance of MAP gas or propane torch, you can quickly and easily repair an oil cooler, radiator, AC line, or any crack or hole in aluminum. And better yet, alloy sol flux is the only flux in the industry that cleans and decontaminates the dirty and greasy surface for you. So you don't even have to worry about that part. The alloy sol rods are actually capable of a 30,000 PSI fix, and they're stronger than even the parent metal, and they're built to last the lifetime of the part. So don't let a simple radiator leak leave you out of the race or broken down in the trail. Bring along some alloy sol aluminum alloy repair rod and flux from SolderWeld. I am constantly asking the guests of this podcast how they attract and retain sponsors. And on almost every single occasion, somebody gives an example of a resume. A rider or a racer resume is extremely important to your overall sponsorship pitch and proposal. And it's tough to do. I mean, it's not really the easiest thing. Anybody can go through and put together a resume, so don't get me wrong there, but it's really difficult to get something that's like unique and different and stands out, and that also is something that can be put across multiple platforms. Well, that's one of the things that I want to talk to you about next is how topthepodium.com can actually help you build a race or rider resume that can be used on multiple platforms. I'm talking like website, PDF, something you can print off that's interactive, that looks fantastic. It looks absolutely professional. Well, that's because it's made by a professional. This is the type of thing that's going to set you apart from the crowd, and that's going to position you for a strong sponsorship proposal. So what I want you to do next is go to topthepodium.com, and if you have a question, there's a little chat icon that pops up on the side of the screen when you go to topthepodium.com, and you can go ahead and type your question right there. Jeff Vanestal, he is the owner of Top the Podium. He's going to be able to respond to you directly, so check it out. I want you to think long and hard about this next question. Where do you think you should be spending your time at? Should it be on developing a sponsorship program, or should it be on cleaning the mud and dirt and filth and grime off your machine? I'm hoping that the answer you're thinking in your head is that you'd like to spend it on your sponsorship program. That's why you're listening to this podcast, and that's where you should be focusing your off-the-track time. But sometimes that mud and grime and whatever, it's there, and you got to get it off your machine, right? And that's actually why I want to talk to you next about Armor Coat, brought to you by Never Lift Racing Company. So Armor Coat products help prevent mud, clay, ice, all that other garbage stuff from sticking to your machine, and ultimately it ends up cutting your cleanup time in half. And I mean, your machine looks great. It leaves essentially a water-resistant shine, helps fight corrosion, and you can use it on like multiple surfaces. So it's ultimately fantastic. And really the purpose of this product, like I said before, is to make the racer's life easier. Now, if this at all intrigues you, I want you to check out Armor Coat at armorcoatproducts.com. Coat is spelled with a K. And when you get there, use promo code ARMOR10 to get 10% off the products. All right, welcome back, everybody. We are now in Heat 2, and as promised, we are going to talk about all of the good details around sponsorship tactics and strategies. So first off, Jim, we've already talked a little bit about your race program and some of the past sponsors you've had, but let's take us to today. You know, who are some of your current sponsors or partners, people that you're working with and getting support from?
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying partners too, because as we dig into this a little bit deeper, that's one thing that you really have to remember is the days of just being a sponsor are gone. What you want to do is be a partner. If you want to continue sponsorship opportunities, become their partner. So to answer your question blatantly, General Tire, Method Race Wheels, Rugged Radios, MagnaFlow Exhaust, Holley MSD, and I've got a slew of others that I want to touch on a little bit. You know, I don't mean to make it like a commercial, but, you know, this is important, and people can also see the magnitude of our program. So we also have Lucas Oil, Bilstein, Biltwell helmets, Creedom sunglasses, Blue Sea Advertising, Get It in Gear Transmissions, CC Motor Coffee Company up in Seattle, Baja Bound Insurance, and McKinsey's Offroad, and iBox Springs. And then we've got a couple people that keep me physically happy, and that's GQ6, which is a hydration mix, and to touch back on Creedom sunglasses, man, keeping my eyes strong. So
Yeah.
in a nutshell, that's who I'm working with right now, and those are all my partners.
Yeah, we talked about this in episode 54 of this podcast. We were interviewing Walker Fowler. He's GNCC racing champion, races ATV and side-by-side, but definitely rocks it in ATV. And he was mentioning, which I lost count in your list there, but he was mentioning he had 36 sponsors as part of his race program that he works with. And that's just incredible. But what I like to touch base on is behind every one of those companies is at least, at a minimum, one human being that you have to work with, build a relationship with, communicate with. At least one. In most cases, probably, especially with some of the larger companies, it's going to turn to 2 to 3 to 4, which means you could easily stack up 50 to 100 people that you're working with consistently. And that's just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, well, and that's why I say we really have to look at them as partners, especially in today's world of sponsorship programs. You know, they really have to become your partners, because oftentimes it's not just that one person, like you mentioned. They report to somebody else and somebody else there, and eventually somebody's got to sign the check, right? And that's the person that you want to understand what your program is and why they're signing that check.
Definitely. I know with this podcast and my other business, Impact Fuel, you know, I think I probably average around 8 to 10 sponsors, and it's hard to keep track of everybody and, you know, keep the communication strong, and that's just a small fraction of what you're talking about right now. So it's I think for people to really think about the gravity of how many people are in your network from a sponsorship standpoint, I think it's important to consider. I mean, even if you think about the grassroots racer, you know, they've got just maybe it's 5 or 10 sponsors that are giving them product discounts. That's still 5 or 10 minimum people that you need to keep a constant communication with. So it's definitely a lot of work.
Yeah, and I would almost suggest that people that are the grassroots just getting started, they might have more, because they're only getting product, and it takes a lot of product to put together a program, you know. Whereas at least we get some checks written to us, and it allows us to kind of streamline our partnerships. The count was 18 sponsors on our team right now that we work with, and I promise you there's more than one person in each one of those companies we have to deal with.
Yeah, as a race program grows, and like you said, you can maybe bring more people on, then you can also start to streamline and automate, and you might be able to make some of these things work more efficiently. But yeah, at a grassroots level, you don't have that yet, and I think that's part of the goal. One of the things we talked about, going back to episode 54 again with Walker Fowler, we talked about the opportunity for virtual assistants, which is, someone where it's a human being somewhere, whether it's, inside the United States, outside the United States, but somebody that you actually pay to support you as if they were, your assistant for whatever it may be. And Walker was talking about potentially using something like that in his race program to help streamline some things that are don't require him to do, but need somebody's attention.
I'll tell you what, when he finds that person, I want to know who it is, because I'm going to hire him too, because he's absolutely right. The challenge that I found with that, because I have hired some agencies, I've worked with Blue Sea Advertising for years on my race program, kind of the posters and the look and feel and the color combinations and stuff like that. But where you really need somebody that's very difficult to find is a social media person that knows enough about your sport to help you with your social media and post relevant, items, whether they be photos or sponsorship items, and keep it relevant because they understand your exact sport and series that you're running in. And that's been really challenging to find.
I completely agree with that. I just finished reading a book. For people listening, it's December 19th of 2017. I just finished reading a book about 2 weeks ago. It was written by Gary Vaynerchuk, called Jab, 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 Right Hook.
Yeah.
And it's all about social media, how to create relevant posts, and it is super complicated.
You're right.
I mean, he does such a good job though in that book of he'll give a post that he found and then just tear it apart. We're talking about big companies. We're not talking about people with 100 followers. We're talking about people who have, hundreds of thousands of followers, and how they just miss the mark entirely. Mm-hmm. And but then he also gives examples about how people just absolutely nail it, and it's incredible. I'll be honest with you, over the past week or so, I've probably changed my social media strategy based off of reading that book.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and there's some awesome resources out there like that. And what's interesting about it is I follow Gary and a lot of things that he does, and he's built an incredible empire. But I've also torn him up on a couple items where I'm watching going, why are people watching this or listening to this right now? So it's relevant, and it's what your audience is looking for. And you have to realize that it's resonating and keep doing it, So although I like Gary, I might not be his audience, so I'm tearing him up a little bit, but clearly he gets who his audience is, and he's built an empire from that. And I can only aspire to build that same size empire.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. While we're kind of on the topic of social media, I normally cover this a little bit later in Heat 2, but just feels right. I mean, what's some of your social media strategies? I mean, we talk a lot on here about what are the right platforms to be on. I mean, where's your head at in that game?
Well, I'd like to take the easy route and just do one or the other, Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, or, whatever it might be. But it doesn't work that way anymore, especially when you have 18 sponsors. Everybody wants a piece of every pie. So to kind of take a step back away from social media first is I approach my sponsors now with the mindset of, what are your strategic plans for next year? What do you want to accomplish in 2018, right? So I'm having these conversations now with my sponsors. What's important to you? How important is social media to you? And if it's social media, what platform are you using, or are you focusing on? And, what medium are you using on that? Are you pushing out video content, or are you doing photos or ads, different things like that? So the key to answering your question there is, I'm doing what my sponsors want me to be doing, and it's different for each one of them, right? And I can share later, some of the mistakes that I've made too in that arena. But right now what I do is I build out a calendar by quarter with each of my sponsors and each social media platform, so Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and I input what each of them want in each of those segments, and then I map out what the quarter looks like. So what that might look like on Monday, I'm going to post something General Tire, the new X3s. Tuesday, I'm going to promote Method Race Wheels durability because that's their big push for first quarter. And then maybe 2 days later, I'm going to post Rugged Radio. They've got a new Air Parker pumper out on the market, and I'm going to post a video about that, right? And so I'm going to work a full quarter that way with each of my sponsors in mind, plugging in advance what we're going to be talking about for them through the different social media platforms. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, what I will tell you, Jim, is that is an actual social media strategy. I used to think that I was pretty awesome for planning out a week, maybe 2 weeks, based off of some things that, I think my sponsors want to see, but that was pretty incredible. There's probably only one other person that we've talked to on this podcast that had a similar mindset. I think it's way back in like episode 9, Sean Endel.
Mm-hmm.
He's a backcountry snowmobiler, and he talked about how he selects his photos because in snowmobiling you only have a certain period of time to create content because you run out of snow.
Yeah, sure.
And so he basically figures out over the course of the year how he's going to spread out his content and share that so that in the summer months he still has adequate content. And I was like, oh, sweet, man, that's awesome. But what you just talked about there is a true strategy in linking what your sponsors' goals are and then tying it to what their quarterly objectives are and then linking that back down to a daily objective. So I don't know if I could have asked for a better example than that.
Well, let me give you an example of why that's so important and, understanding brand strategies, okay? So obviously with 18 companies supporting us, I can't give everybody the focus that I'd like to. Or you're doing what you felt their message was, and maybe you missed the mark a little bit. So I've circled back around with Rugged Radio specifically as an example, and I said, hey, look, guys, 2018's around the corner. What would you really like? And what flushed out of it is I was kind of doing the regular posts with them and showcasing some of their stuff, but what they told me was, Jim, we don't have any video content. We're looking for video content. Now, keep in mind, I film almost every single race with 3 or 4 cameras on my race vehicle, and that content is just sitting on a hard drive going nowhere because I didn't think anybody needed it or wanted it. But yet, at the same time, I hadn't necessarily asked the question either. So Rugged said, look, we're looking for content. We want to promote our new Parker pumpers. We think it's the best on the market. We want to have in-car cam with really dusty scenarios, and we want to start splicing stuff together. Well, I have no idea that that's really what they were looking for. So even as organized as I was, I could have asked a couple more questions and really delivered to them, what they were looking for, what they were missing. Now, the odd part about that to me as a sponsored rider is they have 12 other people at least that they're sponsoring and working with. Some of the teams are much larger than mine with way more resources. And I was assuming that those teams were also delivering everything that Rugged wanted, but nobody was, right? So it goes back to asking the question, asking what their strategy is, and delivering on that, making sure you take the time to write it down and be, point on. Because when it comes time to renew with these guys, and they look back and go, hey, you know what, Riley was the only guy delivering us video content that we wanted in 2017. We're signing him for sure again, right? Mm-hmm. By the way, I got the deal again for 2018, so it worked.
No, that's good. What I'm imagining from this, I really hope that someone right now is in a local, like an ATV racing district, and they're taking a note, and they call up their goggle sponsor, whoever it is, and they ask them that question, like, hey, what are you looking for in Q1 of 2018? Like, I hope that happens, because I feel like that would really set that person apart for future conversations.
Yeah, and you're welcome to share my contact information with your audience, and to a degree, I'd be happy to share some tips with them. Send them an email. on some of the systems that I have in place. Like I said, to a degree, I can't make a job out of it, but I would love to see more teams that are successful in their sponsorship programs. And by the way, just to touch back on your snowmobiler, right? Having enough content year-round because there's snow. I got to talk about something that I'm doing new for 2018 because we're in a similar situation. We've got 6 big races a year. I do a couple pickup races in other series to stay, kind of in race focus and shape. But there's times where we can't deliver fresh content. So what I'm doing is looking at lifestyle footage and what I can do from a lifestyle perspective. And maybe that snowmobile might only run in the winter months, but what is that athlete doing in the summertime that might be interesting to the brands that they're working with? It doesn't have to be snowmobiling. It could be what is their off-season workouts and how does it relate to some of the product development, or maybe it's how does he maintain that snowmobile over the summer or stay in shape for snowmobiling in the winter. And now he starts to provide new content or new relevance to the success of that product and or that rider or that brand, right?
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a good example. It came up fairly recently in episode 53. We were interviewing Kirk Zach. He's the owner of HMK, which is a power sports clothing line, but specializes in snowmobiling. And then Tucker Mertz, who's one of his sponsored riders. So we had him on the call at the same time. And one thing that Tucker does is he's a hunter, which has a similar it's a similar market to what HMK is going after. So what Tucker does is when he goes out hunting, he'll actually post a couple of things from social media where he's hunting, but he's also wearing like maybe one of the mid-layer jackets from HMK, which is perfect, for, some minor movement in a hunting application. But so that's what he'll post that. And that's something HMK is like, oh, I love that. That's perfect. Like that's still hitting our target market, but maybe it's not exactly snowmobilers, but it's still hitting the right people.
Well, and other snowmobilers realize that they're not snowmobiling in the summertime, right?
Right.
What are they doing? Maybe it's a crossover. Maybe it's like with Polaris, maybe it's their ATV or something, that you're using in the summertime. But, you can create a lot of great original content if you think outside the box as a sponsored rider for your brands. And really what that comes down to is understanding who your brands are, what their goals are, what they sell, or what their visions are. If you look at like Lucas Oil, for example, they're a big supporter of mine. They've got a couple charity foundations that have to do with horses and animals, right? Well, I race something with horsepower. I don't race a horse. But yet, if over the summer, if I'm taking my girls out, for a horseback ride, in the mountains, maybe I can relate those photos to Lucas Oil's efforts in raising money to save the horses, right? So it's understanding what different brands' needs are and goals are and connecting your real life into that. So that way it feels a lot more authentic too.
Yeah, I like that because in order for you to make that connection, you do have to know some of the intense details about Lucas Oil. Like I didn't know that, right? I didn't even know that Lucas Oil, has a passion for animals and horses and things like that. So knowing that, I think is pretty powerful.
Well, it just goes back to understanding your partners, who they are, what's important to them, where they're going, and doing the time. When I think about the money that these brands are investing in us as a team, and maybe it's not just money, maybe it's parts. And when you value those parts, if it's $5,000 in free oil or what have you, if you value that, you should take the time to understand their brands and what's important to them, right? Yeah, that's how I look at it.
No, I think that's really good stuff. Well, one of the things that we haven't touched on yet was the contact piece. A lot of people really get hung up on maybe one of the earlier steps, which is how do I actually reach out and make contact with a sponsor? So what would be some of your recommendations, or maybe what have you done in the past to initially reach out?
Well, I have to retract something I said earlier about Smartwater being my first sponsor. Technically, they weren't. They were in four-wheel motorsports. So maybe 5 or 6 years before I started racing off-road, I was a pretty avid dirt biker. That's when I was living in Lake Tahoe. And didn't make a lot of money, but, wanted to ride and have all the neat outfits and stuff. I wrote letters to every manufacturer in Dirt Bike magazine, like trying to get a sponsorship of whether it was a helmet or some pants or, some boots, what have you. And I basically wrote, hey, this is who I am. This is what I do for a living. I found this new hobby. I want to wear your stuff with pride. I want to put your sticker out. This is before social media, by the way. So it wasn't like I'd say, I'm going to post you all over Instagram. I offered what I could as a person, right, to promote their product. And lo and behold, FMF wrote me back and said, you know what, we're going to put you on our rider program. And I got like 60% off of anything I wanted to buy from them, and they just wanted me to put their stickers on there. And, that was kind of my first reach out to get a sponsor, and my first sponsor that came in was FMF. So thanks to those guys, I got a little taste of that. But, as I built a professional race program, General Tire came on early. And fortunately for me, we had just won 2 series championships, and General Tire was a sponsor of that series. So they came to me with an opportunity to work with them. But, it wasn't easy, even though they knocked on my door. I still needed to provide with them what my program looked like. And this goes back to the answer is always yes. And when they knocked on the door and said, hey, we want to sponsor you and work with you, what's your program look like? I said, well, yes, I want to work with you too. Give me a couple days and I'll send you an email with my program. I didn't have a program. I was out. I was out there racing and doing well, and paying for it with whatever I can pull together. And I didn't have a program, but I got on the internet and I looked at what programs look like and what kind of sponsorship presentation I'd put together and what interested sponsors. And I put together a rough version of what my program looked like. I've seen it recently. I just laughed at how I even raised $1 with that thing. But it was enough, and it hit the right touch points for General Tire, and we built our brand around General Tire and our racing around them up to what it is today. And that was really, when they asked, I said yes, and we put together something that made sense. So that's how we got our start.
Oh, that's good. The writing a letter thing. I know people are probably like, "What's a letter? How do I write?" But honestly, that comes up when I ask that question to people. That comes up a lot, even today, as saying it actually might even be more special today because people are not necessarily expecting a handwritten letter.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's still there. It's still an option. It's try it. Try it. See what happens. Worst case is you get no response. That's probably the worst case.
Well, to your point, let's try it. This is the time of year where I like to send out handwritten thank you notes to my sponsors.
Yes.
And throw something in there. Most of these guys have and get what they want, so it's not like you're going to impress them with the present. But, for me, I like to send them something that's important to me. Maybe it's a great shot from a race, race car running through silt with a handwritten thank you, or maybe it's a backpack or something. But recognizing them this time of year with a handwritten thank you note is very important.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Well, everything we've talked about so far has been what I like to call sunshine and rainbows. Was there ever a time, and we don't have to get into names or anything like that, but where things didn't necessarily go that well with the sponsor? I know it happens out in the world. So what's your take on that?
Well, it does happen. Fortunately for me, I've only been dropped once by a sponsor 100%. And it's the call that you don't want to get, because as you're halfway through your racing season, you're already counting the money for next year and thinking about what you're going to do for next year and how you're going to do it. And when you get the call and somebody says, "Well, we're not signing you again," it's disappointing. I think that comes from a couple of things, and in my case, it was a change in direction in staff is why we got dropped, and totally understandable. But I think oftentimes, you're missing the mark or you're not winning the races they'd hoped you'd won so that they can promote your product as a winning team. But, I will tell you what I think the most important thing is when you get dropped is how you handle it. And, you mentioned I've run a couple big companies, and I have. For the record, I've sponsored people as big as Arnold Palmer, for any golf fans listening. I had a multi-year deal with him, and a few other golfers like Peter Jacobson and Scott McCarron. I've sponsored people like James Worthy, used to be with the Lakers, Bill Walton, used to be with the Portland Trailblazers, and then somebody younger like Sonny Garcia, a world champion surfer, as well as a couple as a DJ. One thing that I will tell you and your listeners that is critically important about when you get dropped, handle it with finesse and kindness, because you never know when they want to come back, if they come back, or if the word spreads on the street how you treated them. The way I've approached it is, thank you for believing me in the beginning. Thank you for your support and what you did for me. It got me to the next level. I'm sorry that, we're not a fit for you anymore, but we hope one day maybe you'll come back. That's how you handle that. And as a sponsor of some athletes and other individuals, I've had a couple specifics that I'm not going to talk too deep about, where it was handled with anger and resentment, and I promise you I will never support that person again, right? So handle it with finesse.
Yeah, we've talked about this on the show before, but one of the challenges that comes along with social media, there's a lot of great things that come along with it, but one of the challenges is that if things go south with a deal that didn't extend or didn't work out, and it makes it onto the social media spotlight, then the virality of that post or comment or whatever it is, it can get out of control very, very quickly. And especially in the motorsports world, Amy Hood and I talked about this as 1 degree of separation.
Yep.
That really everybody kind of knows everybody.
Yeah.
And especially everybody's on social media and they see these negative comments or whatever it is blows up very quickly, and no one wants to be associated with that. People step back and they're like, I don't really want to work with this person anymore. I want to stay very clear of them.
Yep. You just let it fade out. Do it gracefully, and if you pick up a competing sponsor to replace them, do it appropriately. There's a right and a wrong way to do everything, and how you treat it is how you will be treated. Because you're right, people are watching. Your current sponsors are watching. When somebody drops off, they want to see how you handle that. And I think oftentimes as sponsored athletes, we take it personal, and it's not oftentimes that personal. We don't understand their business and their 9-to-5 job and what they're dealing with every day in and out. And it could just be a simple budget cut. And typically sponsorships are the first to go. Doesn't mean it's personal against you. It just means that their budgets got cut. And, budgets come back, in good times, budgets come back and sponsorships come back. And if you handle it poorly, they're not going to come back to you, right? So don't take it personal, handle it with finesse, move on, pull your pants back up and go find somebody else. That's what we've always done, and we benefited from that.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. I will tell you, too, for example, I brought up GQ6, which is a hydration sponsor of ours. Their first year with us, they came to us with product and some cash, and they were right out of the gate. They were enthusiastic about their business plan and what they were doing. And, within the first year, they had some things go south from a financial perspective. Didn't mean the product was any less, and they came to me and said, look, Jim, we can't sponsor you anymore. But I grew to love and appreciate the team and their product. I said, that's fine. I want to keep running your logos. I want to keep supporting your product. And, we're happy to be a part of whatever you're doing at any level, and don't worry about paying us. And we've run their logo for the last 2 years without being paid, but merely because we believe in what they're doing. And it was an opportunity for me to give back to a brand that believed in us at one time. And, I guarantee you, because I've talked to the owner, when they're back on top, we're going to be the first people that they want to sponsor and work with. So, these things come back too, and just because they can't pay you doesn't mean you have to drop them altogether. I would encourage people to look at what their business plan is, where they're going, and who they are, and really evaluate, is that somebody you want to drop? Because what happens when they're back on top? All of a sudden you realize, wow, I should have stuck with them, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point. I don't think we've had an example like that on the show before where somebody was saying, I can't continue to support, and you're like, you know what? I see where you're heading with this whole business thing. I'm gonna stick with you, although it might not be in the same deal we had before, but I'm gonna stick with you. So that's cool. I appreciate you sharing that example.
Yeah. And I will tell you, I've got one other brand, and I can't mention who it is because of the business in the back end. Same situation. We stuck with them. They came back, and then when they came back really strong. So, I've actually seen it pay dividends for me to have that approach. So you have to think about this as a business, not just a personal, these guys are sponsoring me, I'm getting their money to go ride my dirt bike or whatever it is, right?
Jim, what other comments do you have just around the whole sponsorship deal? I mean, what's some other tips, tricks, advice, things that we should really take away from this conversation?
Yeah, what I'd like your sponsored riders, athletes to look at is what they do in their daily job. If they're not 100% sponsored, right? Everybody's got something to make their ends meet. And for me, launching my tequila company, AZUñia Tequila, as well as my latest company, which is called Baja United, with both companies, what I did is I leveraged the launch of those companies with my sports. So AZUñia Tequila, I sponsored my race team with it. We didn't have any money because we weren't selling any tequila yet, but I put the logo on my car knowing that my network of fellow off-road racers and sponsors would support what we're doing. So we actually built the brand AZUñia Tequila in off-road racing and built a snowball, or what created a snowball effect of customers built in with people that supported our race team. And then as that brand grew, then we had resources to support back to the race team and kind of I don't want to say co-mingle, but basically work with one another to build both brands, the race team brand as well as the AZUñia Tequila brand. And really thinking outside the box and delivering more to my sponsors than what they were asking for. And the beverage industry is a perfect example to give your people. So for us, General Tire as an example, they had other sponsored riders out there and teams, and they were getting a lot of exposure from it. And we've won 14 races over the last 6 years, been on the podium a bunch, but specifically had won 14 races. But they're looking at how do we grow our brand outside off-road racing. And I said, well, how about for us, what we can offer you is we can do beer coasters. You go in the bar and you're sitting at the bar and they got those little paper coasters with branding on them. Perfect fit for a tire company because it's round. So what we did is we developed beer coasters for our customers across the country. And on one side it looked like a tire, it said General Tire on it, and on the other it was a picture of the race car and our brand AZUñia Tequila. So where this fit in was the bars and restaurants, they want beer coasters because their customers need them. They liked them that they were interesting because they had a race car on them. And for the brands like General Tire, they gained exposure in bars and restaurants where they wouldn't normally advertise and market their brand. So I guess what I'm getting at for people that are working with sponsors is give them some added value in what your daily job is or your company that you own or what you do. Give them extra value so that they see that you're going above and beyond what they're looking for. Now with my new company, Baja United, we're looking and talking to our sponsors about how do we put incentives in place to go down to Baja. We import beer and wine from Mexico. And how do we integrate those experiences with our sponsors and grow their programs? One thing that we're talking about doing is a big giveaway, via billboards, online, etc., to win some items that our sponsors provide, like tires and rims, and give those away through our beer and wine business. So always thinking outside the box based on what you do on a daily basis. And that was a point that I wanted to make earlier when we're talking about my businesses and how do we make them all succeed together.
That's a really good example. It on a smaller scale, it reminded me of something I just experienced a couple weeks ago. Actually, it was last week. I was in Amsterdam for the week, and I was in one of the bars there, and they had coasters, beer coasters, which, a lot of bars have beer coasters. But one thing that was very interesting about this one was the shape of it. So it was not round.
Mm-hmm.
It was, kind of like a triangle shape with rounded edges.
Yeah.
But the glasses that were linked to it was the same shape. So the base of the glass was the same shape as this coaster. Well, it turns out the coaster brand was Bavaria. The glass had a brand logo on it called Bavaria, and every single waiter and waitress in that bar had a Bavaria shirt on. I'm like, wow. But it was just it was so intriguing to me. I was just drawn to it, the fact that they actually matched the bottle shape or the glass shape to the beer coaster, and I remembered that. Like, I just enjoyed the experience. I liked how it lined up. I liked that the logos matched. I liked that the waiter and waitresses were wearing that. And when I got my next beer, I got the same beer again. And actually, honestly, I went to the next bar and I also got the same beer again at that next bar.
See, those things resonate with you, and that's what I'm talking about, is thinking about new ways to promote your sponsors through your program or your daily life, job, company, or whatever it is that you do. I've got another great example of how we added some value to some of our sponsors through a retail partner. And, these things happen to us as athletes. You start building these relationships. You spend time, eating out or going to bars or whatever it is, your gym or what have you. There's a very popular beach bar in Needles, California called Pirates Cove. And Pirates Cove is famous for RV camping as well as boating, and they have the pull up on the beach with your boat type thing. Well, they were getting ready to launch like 2,000 acres of UTV terrain that you can go out and ride your UTVs on while you're camping. And they said, "Hey Jim, how can you help us? Can you bring your race car out or something?" I said, "You know what? I got a couple ideas." What we wound up doing is putting the owner of the place in my race car. And we went and drove and filmed riding around some of their acreages out there, as well as putting a UTV out there and film that. And what I delivered back to them was a branded, I think it was 6 minutes worth of video, right? So the intro of the video thanked my sponsors, went into this cool race around their course deal in my race truck as well as the UTV, promoting what they were opening up and trying to sell their customers. And then it finished off with a thank you, and some more of my very top sponsors got a second logo on there. So where that value comes in is, me as an athlete, I'm gaining exposure on these TVs at this bar that they've been airing for almost 2 years now, right? It's on a loop, and they mix it in with the other stuff. So now as an athlete, I'm getting more exposure. The bar itself is happy because they've got some great, cool content on their TV. And 6 of my sponsors, they're thrilled because their logos are popping up on this video every day for the last 2 years at no additional cost to them, right? So it's just thinking outside the box, filling a need, and involving everybody in that fulfillment. And that's how you give and deliver sponsors more than what they ask for.
No, definitely.
Yeah. And I guess that goes along with saying, if you've got $100,000 sponsorship from somebody, allocating, before you spend that money, allocating a portion of that, I like to look at about 10 to 15% of that, reinvesting that in specific media spends and buys, to continue to promote yourself and those brands and securing really some great coverage, right? So I've been fortunate enough, actually there's an article in Roadkill magazine last quarter about me and the race team and some cool stuff we did down in Baja. I've been fortunate enough to get an article almost every year written about us, including some great stuff in Hot Rod magazine. But if you didn't have that, you can always pay for advertorials. You can even run an ad with a little bit of money and continue the story in print so that your sponsors are happy to see what you're doing. I just think it's so important that you reinvest, before you blow your money on other things, like that extra spare part or that new set of pants or something, that you reinvest up front those dollars into promoting your brand and their brand, whether that's in print media, social media, or something, but spending some of those hard dollars to keep your brand alive and going.
That's definitely good info.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I typically take some time in this podcast to dive into mindset. But honestly, we covered a lot of the things earlier on. I mean, we talked about some strong quotes, what you believe is what you achieve, and we talked a lot about thinking outside the box. So we may have already accomplished the goals that I normally set out for the main event. Is there anything else, though, that from a mindset standpoint that you think everybody listening should just hear?
Well, don't take sponsorships for granted, and you have to work those programs, if you want them to come back year after year. Take the meetings with the sponsors to understand what their goals are, and, appreciate them for what they're bringing to the table. They're allowing us to do something that most people consider a luxury or a hobby or something fun. I treat it like a job. I go to work on my sponsorships and my race program like a job because people are paying money for us to do what we do. And when you stop thinking about it that way, I think that's when you stop respecting the money and the effort that's being put out. Remember, these people have objectives to achieve through their sponsorship, and it's our job to help them do that. And the great part about it is we get to go out there and ride our vehicles or race our cars for them and enjoy that side of it. But, like you said earlier, there's probably a couple people behind the scenes. Somebody's got to sign the check and say yes. And at the end of the day, our contact needs to keep them happy, right? So never take that for granted. I'm constantly inspired by people around me and what they're doing and looking at other programs. And I'm not afraid to ask them, hey, how do they do it and what keeps them going? So you mentioned Amy Hood earlier. That girl is on a mission right now, and she surrounds herself with some cool people. I've spent a little bit of time with Sarah Price out at some of the races. She's on a mission, and it's fun for me to watch these younger, in this case, females, coming through the ranks, delivering to their sponsors, and having some fun with it. So, I'm inspired by people that are coming up, and that's who I look out for and what they're doing and how they're doing it, because I don't want to get stale in what I'm doing, and I want to always be delivering the next best thing to my sponsors.
Yeah. For people listening, if you want to know a little bit more about Amy Hood, she was on episode 7 of this podcast, and Sarah Price was on episode 12. Now, a lot has changed in both of their worlds since they last were on the show, so maybe they need to come back in for a refresher. But like Sarah is, I cannot keep track of Sarah. I mean, she's on Hoonigans. She hopped in a trophy truck. She's still doing stadium trucks.
Yeah.
She still hops on a dirt bike here and there. She's everywhere.
Yeah,
she's all over the place.
Super low key, and I see her at the races because she's racing in my class off and on now in the Spec Trophy Truck Series. And I talked to her in the pits, and she's psyched to be out there. But even somebody with the following that she has, she talks to me about, hey, I got to get sponsors. What's your approach? So we all have the same issues. But it's how we deal with it and how we go after it. And it's fun to look at the other side of it, especially following Sarah and Amy and all the things that they're doing. But, I guarantee you they're working it hard on the other side, and most people don't see that. So hats off to them for what they're doing, too.
Definitely. And to your point about, Sarah being approachable and things like that, I was at the Vegas to Reno race in 2017. Saw Sarah, walked up to her, hey, remember me from the podcast? Oh, yeah, we chatted for, 10 minutes or something, and that was fantastic, and I watched her throughout the day, and she did that to everybody, right?
Yep.
Yep. And it's, I think it really sets yourself in a very good light. I mean, honestly, Travis Pastrana was there as well, and he was, did the race in the Razor Star car with Jim Beaver and Jolene Van Vute, and he gave me a couple minutes of recording time for the podcast, and he also talked to tons and tons of people. I mean, walked up to, say hello to babies and, moms and dads and kids and brothers and uncles and everybody. And I think that says a lot.
Yeah, I learned something interesting about my own social media as it relates to Travis, right? So I was also out there for that race. I did the show with Jim Beaver, and Travis was on after me, so he came a little bit early and had a chance to talk to him and get a photo with him and stuff. Oftentimes as athletes, we post stuff up on social media. Of course, we all want to see how many people liked it and viewed it and shared it and all that stuff. And most often you think, gosh, not many people like that photo or people aren't paying attention. I posted a picture with Travis on my Instagram, and I had like 5 times more likes and comments than I've ever had. And the whole time I'm thinking nobody's paying attention to me, right? So lesson learned, people are paying attention. Just because they don't comment or hit like doesn't mean they're not watching, right?
Yeah,
so
that's a very good point.
It took somebody like Travis on my Instagram to see how many people were actually watching.
That's a very, very good point.
Yeah, so always mind your P's and Q's, right?
Yes, that is another. That's a very, very important topic. Is there's someone always watching as well, and social media is pretty powerful.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, cool. At this point, Jim, I think it's time that we head to the finish line, wrap things up. You've given us some really good advice. Is there one thing, if people forgot every other thing that we talked about today, is there one thing that they could take away from this conversation?
Well, I just reiterate my motto. The answer is yes, right? Keep saying yes. Work towards your goals, because what you believe is what you're going to achieve. And I'll say it again. If somebody wants to reach out to me, be happy to throw a couple things their way. Feel free to get in touch with me through your podcast, through my email address. Follow me on Instagram, Jim Riley Racing, Riley, and you can direct message me there too. I'm very active in everything that I do, and I guess that would be the last piece of advice is be active in your program, man. Be excited about it, and make people excited for you and what you're doing, and be humble with it.
Yeah, that's good advice. We can all learn from that for sure. Well, at this point, I think it's time to say goodbye. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and share your experiences and your knowledge. At this point, I'm going to leave it at this. Have fun and ride safe.
Will do.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Sponsored Rider Club podcast. I really appreciate you supporting this show and the motorsports industry in general. Make sure that you subscribe. That way you don't miss any of our upcoming guests. Next up, we have Sarah and Caden Danbury coming on, and they're going to talk about youth racing and the sponsorship programs that come along with that. If you would be so kind as to head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review, that would be phenomenal because that helps drive more exposure and ultimately more growth for this show. Special thanks for this episode goes out to our sponsors, Neverlift Racing Company, specifically the Armor Coat product line, SolderWeld, Bold Racing and Suspension, and TopThePodium.com. I also want to give another shout out to our special project sponsors, and that is MBRP, HMK USA, and Sudboy Traction. Make sure that you're following the Sponsored Rider Club podcast on our social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram with the handle Sponsored Rider Club Podcast, all one word, and then Twitter is SRC Podcast. I look forward to serving you again next week, and until then, have fun and ride safe.